This is an exciting tutorial. We're going to be doing some really cool stuff. So the first thing we're going to do is create an enemy in Photoshop. Then what we're going to do is to bring that enemy into Unity. And then once we've done that, we're going to create a spawning point that's going to move across the top of the screen. Once we've done that, we're going to then create the enemy as a spawning object and then as a prefab, and then have that spawner, as it moves across the screen, drop these enemies down. And it's going to do it randomly. Then to finish it off, we're going to destroy those enemy objects once they've hit the bottom of the screen. Hey, I'm Jerry from Bliz Studio, creator of the Apple featured game Trixel Rocket. And don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and that little bell icon down there so you know when the next video is available. And if you're ready to get started, let's go. So let's get started. So here is the game as we have it right now. So if I hit play, you can see that I've got my background moving. I've got a spaceship that then moves across the screen. So we're doing good there. Now let's go ahead and create an enemy. So I'm going to go back to Photoshop. And the one thing that I want you to take note of is that we have the size of 1920 by 1080 as the screen size. So we need to kind of think about how large our graphics are. Now, one of the things that I notice in students and other game developers is that they create their graphics really big because I want all this detail in there. But you really need to create the graphics at the size that they're going to be on the screen. Otherwise, you're just wasting a lot of size. What I'm going to do is I have the size of the screen right here. And in Photoshop, I'm going to hit tab. And I'm going to scale this up so that it's at 100%. And you can see it's actually pretty big screen. So as I'm designing, I can know exactly what the size of the ships are going to look like. Okay. Hit tab again so I have all my windows back. And I'm just going to create a super simple graphic for the enemy. I'm going to go ahead and just create a new layer. And I'm going to call this enemy. Now I'm actually going to just copy this out and paste it into its own little document, but for now, and there's a lot of different ways that you can create this. Now, depending on if you're creating a pixel art game or something else, you can create this however you want. But I'm just going to create a really simple graphic so that we are keeping the tutorial simple. And I'm just going to take my lasso tool and I have it as straight lines because my ship is, angular. I'm going to create my enemy ship as angular too. And so I'm just going to create some little ship that has some angles to it, and we want it to kind of like be pointy. Okay, so something like that. So I'm going to zoom in now. So I have a selection created. And I'm just going to fill this. Let's go ahead and turn this background on so we can see what we are dealing with. And, if you kind of think of something that's enemy-like, let's maybe do something that's a little bit on the orange or reddish side so that it's more aggressive, I guess. And let's see. I'm going to go ahead and edit and fill, or Shift F5. And, we could call that done, but I'm just going to go ahead and maybe put in like a little cockpit looking thing right here. And again, I'm not spending hardly any time on this. I'm just keeping this super simple. And let's just go with a darker color and then fill that. There we go. And then I'm just going to take and lock the pixels so that it's just So I'm just drawing on the pixels that are actually there. And yeah, let's call that good. So I've just made a selection that's inner. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna hit the Command U key, Control U, brings up the hue and saturation. I'm just gonna take the lightness of that down. So it's just creating a little bit of an effect. So it's something that's there. Now it's subtle, but that's okay. All right, so now that I have that, let's go ahead and copy that out. So I've selected it. I'm opening it up in a new document. I'm pasting that down. I'm gonna get rid of the background so it's a transparent graphic. And then let's just go ahead and save that. And I'm gonna save that straight into my sprites folder, and I'll just call this enemy. We are done with that. Let's go ahead and pop over to Unity. All right, so now here we are in Unity. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a enemy spawner. So I'm just gonna drag one of the enemies in, and I'm actually going to just use this to spawn. So let's move this up the screen, and I'm actually going to then move this up off the camera, out of the camera. But for now, we'll go ahead and just move it so where it's kind of off the screen, and then we'll move it up eventually. The first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that this is on the same Z-axis as the character. So my player, my rocket is on a Z-axis of 0. And then I also want to make sure my enemy is on the Z-axis of 0. So that way, you know, if we look at them from the side, you know, those two things are going to touch. And I'm going to change the name of this to enemy dash spawner. What I'm using this sprite for at the moment is just to have an object that we can then spawn from. So we have our spawner in the space that it needs to be. And what we're going to do is with this state, we're going to have this be spawner. And so I just want to name it. So I'm going to go ahead and just call it spawner. And then the first thing that we want to do is set up a variable. Now this variable is, again, remember, it's a package of information. And the thing that I want that package to store is the speed of that spawner. So I want the speed of the spawner to be random. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a random float, and there we go. So we're going to bring that in. So you can see it's red. It's letting us know that there's information that we have to do. And so I'm going to have this be the speed of the game object. So currently we don't want it to be 0. Let's say from 1 to 2. Now these, again, the random float is just a number, but we're going to use that number in an animation so that we can then change the speed of this object in between 1 and 2. And we're going to use that 1 unit every second. Okay. And then we need to store this. So we're going to create a new variable. Remember, a variable is just kind of like a package of information. And we'll call this spawner speed. And I'm going to create a variable. If we go over to our variables, you can see that spawner speed, and it's a float. Okay. So it's going to be a random number in between these two numbers. Okay. So we've just stored that information. Now we need to then go and animate this spawner back and forth across the screen. So we're going to do an iTween, and we're going to do a move by. And then what is it that we want to move? Well, we're going to move the spawner itself. So we'll go ahead and leave that as owner. And then the vector that it's looking for is the distance. Okay, so we can either create a variable and apply that distance and store that. In this case, I'm just going to uncheck the use variable and then just hard code in the distance that this thing is going to move. So here is our game object right here. Currently it's at -99 or -9.99. So let's just say -10. And then if I move over across the other side of the screen, it's at +10. So that's really a distance of 20. Okay, so let's undo that. So we know that the X, we want to move it by 20 units. So again, remember each of these little squares on the screen is a unit. So we're going to move it by 20 units. And then time, we're actually going to use that variable that we set up as the speed. So here we can then check and use the variable spawner speed. This is the time it's going to take to move that 20 units. And then speed, we're not going to worry about because we're animating over time. Easing type, we're going to go ahead and just leave that as linear. So here's the next thing. We want to set up a loop because we want this thing to continually move across the screen. So if we go into loop, there's two types of loop. There's loop and ping pong, or none. If it's a loop, it's going to start at the beginning, move across the screen. As soon as it's done, it's going to immediately pop back to its original position and then move across the screen again. If we do a ping pong, it's going to start at the left side of the screen, move to the right, and then go move back to the left. So it's going to do this ping pong thing. So that's what we're going to use in this case. We're going to use a ping pong loop. And then space is world space. We're going to leave that there. We don't need to worry about look at. We are not going to set up any kind of a finishing event, and we want to loop and don't finish because we're not going off to another state. We're going to leave this as a looping animation inside of this state. Okay, so let's give this a test just to see if it moves across the screen. And there we go. It is bouncing back and forth. So that's cool, but it's actually moving just maybe a touch fast. So if we go to our random float, we can just change these numbers. So let's maybe say 2 to 4. Let's see how that goes. And that's probably a little more reasonable. Again, it's one of those things you can just play with the numbers to see how it goes. Okay, so we've got that set up. So this is our spawner. Now that we have that set up, let's go ahead and just move it off the screen because we don't want to see this thing. All we want to see is the objects that spawn from it. Okay, so now we need to go ahead and we've created the spawn mover. And then inside of that, we're actually going to create another FSM. And we're going to do this by creating an empty game object. So this is actually going to be the spawn point. And I'm using an empty game object because it doesn't really need to hold anything except for the FSM. So we're going to go spawn point. That spawner is moving the spawn point left and right. And then we also need to go ahead and create our ship. So I'm going to drag another version of the ship on the screen. So again, this one up here that we're using is for me just a visual reference. But here is actually going to be the enemy itself. So I'm going to create an enemy. And then I also want to add a rigid body to this. So the rigid body gives this thing weight and gravity is going to affect it. So it's going to move it down the screen. So with that object selected, we're going to go ahead and add component and we'll do rigid body. And this is a 2D graphic. So we're going to add rigid body 2D. And then mass is 1. If we change either mass or scale, it's going to change the speed at which this drops. So let's just test this real quick to see how it goes. If it drops really fast or slow. And so, you know, that's okay. If we want to, we can half that speed. So let's say 0.5 for gravity instead of 1. And it'll move just a little bit slower. Yep, so that's not too bad. Let's go ahead and just leave it at that. Okay, so now that we've set up our enemy, we need to go ahead and create this as a prefab. In my project window, I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder for prefabs. So prefabs are objects that we can reference to and use over and over and over in the game. So we have this enemy, we've kind of set it up with a rigid body, and I also want to tag this just so that we can have reference to it later on. So I'm going to create a new tag. So here in the inspector, I have this enemy selected. In the inspector, go to tag. I'm going to add tag. So there's currently some predefined tags that are in Unity, but we want to add our own. So I want to call this enemy. Click save. Then I go back to my enemy. And then now you can see enemy is one of the tags. So I can let things know that this is an enemy. All right, so we've got it tagged. And now that we've done that, I'm going to take this game object from here in the hierarchy and drag it into my prefabs folder. So once I've done that, you can see that it's created this little blue icon next to it, and it's done it here as well. That lets you know that this thing is a prefab. Okay, once I've done that, I can go ahead and just delete it off the screen, because what we're going to do is have that spawn point then, create those on the screen for us. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can go back to our spawn point and set up a FSM for this. So the first thing we're going to do is I have my spawn point selected. First, we've got our enemy spawner that moves across the screen. Inside that, we've created an empty game object, and then that game object we're going to create an FSM to. Now let's move this over here, and I'm going to call this spawn. We'll call this random weight. So we're setting up a random weight. So again, this state is just a name, but I'm going to go to, let's type in weight, and you can see there's two different types of weight that are here. There is weight, and it's just one period of time, so 1 second, 2 second, whatever you set. Or you can do a random weight, which you can see is randomly weighting in between 1 and 2 or 3 and 4, whatever it is you want to set that up to be. So that's the event that I'm going to use. And I'm going to set this up to say like maybe 1, 2, 3 seconds. So every 1 to 3 seconds, it's going to wait. So it's kind of like a timer. So it's waiting randomly between those two numbers. When it's done, we're going to send it to a new state that's then going to create that game object, that prefab that we did on the screen, wherever that spawner is. So let's go ahead, and we need to add a finished event. So let's go add finished transition. We're going to add a new state. This is going to be spawn enemy. And we're going to click and transition over to spawn enemy. Now in the spawn enemy event, we actually need to create a game object. So we go to create, and here you can see we've got create object. So we're going to use that event. And then the game object that we want to use, or what object do we want to create on the screen? So we've set up that enemy as a prefab. We're going to drag that from our project window over into that game object. So the FSM is going to wait for a random period of time. Then it's going to go to the spawn enemy and create that. And we need to set up a transition to go back to the random wait again. So add a finished event, and then we're going to transition back to random wait. So this is a nice little loop, because what it's going to do, it's going to wait for in between 1 to 3 seconds. Then it's going to go over to spawn enemy, and it's going to create one of our enemy game objects, and then it's going to go back to random wait. So we've added our enemy game object. That's the object we're going to create. The other thing that we need to do is to add a spawn point. So here we've set up that spawn point. So all we need to do is just drag that from our hierarchy right into the spawn point. So wherever this is positioned on the screen, that's where it's going to create our enemy. So let's go ahead and hit play and give this a test. And if we did it right, there we go. It's creating our enemies that are dropping down the screen. So let me go back to my scene just so we can see what's happening. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. So you can see that our spawner is moving across the screen, and then at random points or random times, it's waiting a little bit, and then it's going to the spawn enemy, and it's creating the spawn enemy. Now I think this is probably a little bit on the slow side. So what I'm going to do is to go to my random wait and then increase the time or decrease the time from 1 to 2. So let's see if that, maybe let's just go from 0.5 to 2. And give that a test. Again, we can go back to our scene to see where our spawner is and what's happening. Yeah, that's looking pretty good, I think. And again, it's one of these things you can just play with the numbers to see what really works for you. And I almost even think that can even go faster. Let's say 0.25, Instead of 2, let's go 1.5. Yeah, there we go. That's looking pretty good, I think. Cool. All right, so we now have our enemy that spawns. Now, if we play this real quick, there's one thing that we need to take note of. You'll notice in the hierarchy that we now have an enemy being spawned, and every time one of these enemy game objects is spawned, it's adding it to the screen. So if you think about this, it's going to just continually spawn, and there's going to be more and more of these game objects. It's going to take more and more of your memory on your phone or whatever device. So what we need to do is once they're off the screen, we need to go ahead and destroy those. So we're going to create this little barrier, and it's going to be off screen. So when the game object hits that barrier, it's going to destroy itself. So again, I'm just going to use my little enemy sprite that I have here, just so it's kind of associated with the enemy. And I'm going to rename this. We'll call this Destroyer. And I'm going to move this so that it's off screen. And I'm just going to change the size of it. Again, it's off screen. It doesn't really matter what it is. And something like that. The other thing that we need to do with this game object is we need to add a collider to it. So we're going to, with the destroyer selected, in the inspector, we're going to go add component, and we need to add a collider, box collider 2D. And then you can see it adds this green box. So what's going to happen is we're going to add a collider to our enemy spaceship as well. And when those two colliders connect, we're going to do something. What that something is we're going to tell the game object to destroy itself. Okay. So we also need to tag this. So let's just go ahead and create a new tag, and we'll call this Destroyer. And then we can go back to our game object and go ahead and tag that as Destroyer. All right, so now that we have that, what we're going to do is we need to go back into our enemy prefab. So I'm going to double click on the prefab over here. So we're inside of our enemy prefab, and I need to add another component, which is a box collider 2D. So I'm going to add box collider 2D to that as well, so that when the destroyer and the ship collide, then I'm going to apply an action. So in this case, we definitely want this to be a trigger. So I'm going to go ahead and add trigger there. Okay, so we have the trigger set up. Now we need to go ahead and add an FSM. So I'm going to create an FSM and move that over, and I'm going to call this trigger state. And I do want there to be a finished transition, and then I'm going to add a new state, and I'm going to call this destroy self. I'm going to take finished and drag it over to destroy self. Okay, so we need to set up a trigger event. So the trigger is when those two game objects touch, then I want to go over to destroy self, and then I'm going to apply a destroy self event. So in the trigger, let's go trigger in our actions. So here we go. We want to add a trigger 2D event because it's a 2D game object. So we're going to use the owner, and then trigger on trigger 2D enter. That's fine. And then we want to determine what we've connected to. And so in this case, we've tagged our destroyer block, and then right down here, the tag of destroyer. So when our enemy has hit that destroyer, then we want to send an event, and we're going to do a finished event. And so once those two have connected, we're going to send it over to destroy self. Okay, so now we need to create the action for that. So there is destroy, if I can type, destroy self right there, boom. We're gonna add that action in, and that's all we need to do. So once that drops down and it connects with destroy self, boom, it will kill that game object. And we don't need to add any more transitions, because then it's gonna just be off the screen. So let's go back over into our scene and let's give this a test. I'm going to go back into my scene view so we can see it. And you can see each of those game objects is being destroyed as soon as it hits this destroyer. And then that way we only have very few of these on the screen versus a continued pile. Very, very cool. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As a recap, we went and we created an enemy object in Photoshop. Then we went to Unity. Then we created a spawner that moved across the top of the screen randomly. And then from that spawner, we created an enemy that would then drop down. And then at the end, we created an object at the very bottom of the screen that would destroy the enemies once they got off screen. And again, if you like this tutorial series, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and that little bell icon down there so you know when the next tutorial is available. Until next time, keep on creating.